Hello, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to join us today. Our session is titled Finding Our Way, the Future of Constitutionalism in Ethiopia. My name is Sarah Bushan. I am the president of the Ethiopian Legal Professionals Association of North America, ELPANA, your host today. We are excited to bring you this webinar on constitutionalism. As educated in the law, we understand constitutions provide the basic legal framework for democracy and the rule of law. They're essential to building peace, accountability, create inclusive institutions in divided societies, and determine equitable distribution of power. It comes as no surprise then that constitutions play a central role in any meaningful political and socio-economic transformations and become even more critical in highly divided societies such as Ethiopia. We are hopeful, therefore, that today's webinar, presented by an internationally recognized scholar in constitutional law, whose experience not only spans over 3 decades, but covers multiple jurisdictions, will shed more light on the topic and serve to engage us in open, honest, and robust dialogues and discussions, which are critical in building consensus and connections, which in turn are important for building a constitutional culture. Our moderator for the webinar today is Daniel Wubishet. Daniel is a member of the ELPANA Board of Directors. He is a corporate and business lawyer currently serving as Associate General Counsel of Emergent Biosolutions, a biopharmaceutical company in Maryland. Daniel graduated with an LLB from the Addis Ababa University Faculty of Law in 1993, an LLM from the University of Michigan Law School, and a JD with honors from the University of Maryland Carey School of Law. Relevant to our discussion today, between 1993 and 95, Daniel worked on various rule of law and constitutional reform initiatives in Ethiopia as program coordinator of the Human Rights Center of the Addis Ababa University Faculty of Law. It is now my pleasure to turn over the program to Daniel. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. Hopefully folks can hear me. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. For those of you who are joining from Ethiopia. Welcome to our webinar, Finding Our Way, the Future of Constitutionalism in Ethiopia. Before I do a little bit of a positing of the seminar and introduce our distinguished guest today, I would like to do some housekeeping. First of all, the estimation for the total webinar would be about 2 hours, and it's divided into 2 parts. The first one, or the first session, is about 55 minutes, and it will be a presentation by Professor Adeno Addis. And then the second half of the session would be about 60 minutes of Q&A, or questions and answers. Questions can be sent via the Zoom chat option during the first session, and I will catalog those questions and try to sort of put them in buckets so that we can send and share with Professor Adeno. Additional questions may also be sent as time allows during the Q&A session. The webinar will be recorded and it will be made available on demand on our YouTube page after the event. And shortly and hopefully soon, once our website elpana.org gets finalized, we would also host the webinar. I'd like to actually, give a shout out and thanks Dimitri, who has been, exceptionally helpful in helping us in terms of our tech issues here. So before I introduce Professor Adeno, let me just posit the context of this presentation and why we chose the topic, finding our way in discussing constitutionalism around that. Many of you, or some of you, have sent me a text, as you were sort of, asking you for joining the session. Is this the right time for us to have a discussion on constitutionalism due to the all the difficulties and challenges we hear about events and developments in Ethiopia? I think it's actually the right time to do it. I think finding our way out of those challenges require us to sort of do a self-reflection and be able to understand what the challenges are and how to deal with them. And I'm happy to say that we actually have the right person to help us to think through the challenges and the promises of constitutionalism. Professor Adeno is currently the W.R. Irby Chair and W.R. Forrester Professor of Public and Constitutional Law at the Tulane University School of Law in New Orleans, Louisiana. Professor Adeno Addis had his BA and LLB, first-class honors degrees from Macquarie University in Australia, and also his LLM and JSD degrees from Yale University in the US, in Connecticut. Professor Addis is an internationally recognized scholar whose expertise spans a range of areas, including human rights, constitutional law, political and legal theory. He has published extensively in law and social science journals in the United States and elsewhere. And he has also taught not only at Tulane, but in many law schools in the US, Australia, Germany, Hong Kong, and Japan. I'm sure he would do a little bit more about the context of what he wants to do today around the concept of constitutionalism, the idea of the culture. But I just want to make sure that when we ask questions and we sort of think about that broader cultural sort of design issue, we will entertain all questions that would come from our attendees today. But just want to make sure that we're not most probably going to do a provision by provision critique of the 1995 Constitution, but I'm sure structural and other issues might be discussed. And I'm looking forward to having a great and interesting, thought-provoking discussion. So without further ado, Prof, welcome to ELPANA.
Thank you. You hear me clearly, Daniel?
Yes, Prof. Yep, I can hear you.
All right. Thank you to Daniel, and thank you to the organization for providing such a forum for the purpose of Ethiopians exchanging views on matters that touch on the legal relevance for the country and our country. And I can say our country, even though I have been out of the country for many years, too many to count, because it is a country that shaped the first 2 decades, crucial decades of my life. And of course, there are relatives and friends that keep me connected. And thank you for inviting me to join this conversation. And I very much want it to be a conversation. So I mean to leave time for questions and answers. If I use the word finally more than once, Daniel might want to remind me that the word has been invoked once. I once heard a preacher say that if you hear a preacher say finally, don't believe him or her because he or he is at the middle. And I hope that won't be the case here. Special thanks to Sarah for being extraordinarily patient as we worked on dates that would suit both the organization and myself. A less committed person would have had good reason for giving up early, but she persisted. And I'm thankful she did persist. Whether or not you'll be thankful remains to be seen. Our country is under enormous stress, as Daniel just mentioned. Perhaps some people feel this is not the time to talk about the Constitution because there are many stresses coming from many sources, both internal and external. Ethiopia is, of course, no stranger to stress, but this seems to be a particularly difficult time. And they say the problems seem to come from various directions. But I want to talk about a particular stress that I think has contributed to the condition that the country finds itself in. And that is one aspect of national life that I want to talk about today. And that is the constitutional structure which set up the government, structure of government within which the country has operated for the last 3 decades or so. As you see, the title is a lofty one. It says Finding Our Way, and it talks about constitutionalism. Let me talk about the title, both to explain why I chose that title and to temper expectation. Tempering expectation being an important announcement of a speaker. First, the explanation. The reason why I used constitutionalism rather than the simple word constitution is not for the purpose of sounding fancy, although there is nothing wrong in sounding fancy, but to signal two important facts, constitutional facts. The first is to make the point that a well-structured and well-functioning constitutional order is more than the text of the Constitution. It has a constitutional culture or convention that accompanies that Constitution or that document. Constitutional culture, like any other culture, functions well when it becomes a habit, a way of life, when it shapes and constrains the actions of relevant actors as a matter of course. When relevant actors act consistently, not only with the text of the Constitution, but with the spirit of the Constitution. For any culture, to emerge or develop, it has to be systematic and consistent. And it is no different with constitutional culture. There has to be systematic and consistent practice. As I say, it is not different with constitutional culture. How does that culture emerge in the constitutional realm? It emerges through the interpretive process. Constitutional interpretation will always be central or a central part of a constitutional-based system. The issue always is what organ should engage in constitutional interpretation so as to entrench the constitutional culture. In my view, it would be an independent judiciary, whether that is a court of general jurisdiction, such as the United States and Canada, or a specialized court, such as South Africa and Germany. An independent judiciary, through a consistent and systematic interpretive processes, will better entrench a constitutional culture. As you might by now have realized, I'm not a big fan of entrusting constitutional interpretation to a political body, as does the Ethiopian Constitution in Article 62(1). A political and partisan body is unlikely to contribute to the building of a constitutional culture. This is so because interpretation by such bodies are likely to be not only political and partisan, but they will be non-systematic and episodic. You can't build a culture that way, nor will you garner legitimacy among the relevant actors or the general public. Judicial interpretation will not only be a more suitable process for developing a coherent and stable constitutional culture, but it would also be the appropriate organ to fill constitutional gaps, dealing with issues that were not anticipated by the framers of the document. You see, it is in the very nature of things that constitutions often have principles at an abstract and high level. They clearly have some specific provision. Say, for example, if a provision says that a person cannot be president unless he or she attains the age of 35, there no amount of interpretation would alter 35. But that's not what most provisions of constitutions are. They talk about equality, they talk about due process. But those provisions need interpretation. What constitutes equality under specific given circumstance? And I believe a constitutional court or a general court would be the appropriate organ to deal with those interpretive processes. Of course, there is always the amendment process. But going to the amendment process every time there is a perceived constitutional gap is both impossible because of the amendment process and unwise. It is unwise and undesirable because what a country should not do is turn its constitution into a glorified statute. It's always difficult to look at many constitutions could go on for forever because they keep on amending. So this is a long way around of saying that one of the reasons why I use the term constitutionalism is to say that constitutions are more than, constitutionalism is more than a document. It is more than a specific document. There is a culture. You see, the American Constitution is merely 7,600 words. To be exact, 7,591 words. Chief Justice John Marshall, the third Chief Justice of the United States Constitution, the United States Supreme Court, made the Constitution what it is today. It is the court that has put on that document a great deal of the constitutional flesh. If you think the US is too distant, too different a culture, you might want to look at the Constitutional Court of South Africa. That court too has entrenched a constitutional culture, and so has the Supreme Court of India. It's not the length of constitution that matters. Rather, it is whether or not those constitutions have gotten the basic structure correctly. Sometimes, as I said, constitutions go on and on as if they want to resolve every single issue as a constitutional issue. There is virtue in deferring some issues and dealing with them at another time. I've written an article claiming that sometimes constitutions should consider incompletion as a virtue. If people want to talk about the legitimate process of constitutional interpretation during the question and answer session, I'll be quite happy to go further into detail about constitutional interpretation. The second reason why I use constitutionalism is to signal that the constitutional order of a country is not just about the national document, but includes the constitutional structure of the regional or sub-national units as well. The interplay between the national constitution and the constitutions of the various constituent states makes constitutionalism of a country. We see those constitutions have significant impact on the lives of citizens, for good or for ill, symbolically or substantively. They tell us a great deal about inclusion, about exclusion, citizenship, alienage, insiders, outsiders, primary stakeholders, and others. So when we talk about constitutionalism in Ethiopia, we ought to think about those documents as well. Now, managing expectations. When I say finding our way, I'm not promising that I'm going to clearly outline which way the constitutional path is. I simply want to highlight some important principles about constitutions, what they do, and how they do them, so as to compare them to the Ethiopian circumstance. To be sure, I have started to be actively engaged in exploring more closely the Ethiopian Constitution, at least in the last year or so. And I have in the past written on aspects of ethnic rights, on the deliberative process in fractured societies. As I intend to participate both in forums like this and in writings to contribute to whatever I can and to whatever capacity I have about the optimal constitutional order for the country. So by finding our way, I mean to say that the constitution that Ethiopia has or must have is one that balances carefully the diversity of the country and the need to have a national identity. Whatever else we have, we ought to have a system that gestures in both directions. And it's not usually a good thing to suggest amendment to one part or another part of the Constitution without knowing what the other parts are. Constitutions are compromises. Constitutions have to hang together. And that's what I hope is going to happen. At least the discussion will start after the election. And we all hope that there's going to be fair and free election. What I want to do in the next part of my talk is two things. One is to talk about constitutions and what they do, at least what they are meant to do. And then to assess some aspects of the Constitution of Ethiopia to see how well that document fulfills or measures up to those constitutional structures. What do constitutions do? Well, a constitution, of course, is the basic fundamental law of the state. By basic or fundamental, I mean to say that it is the source of all other laws within the particular state, and any inconsistent law with it will be preempted. That is well known. It is basic, however, in another sense. It defines both the basic structure and the identity of the political community. In some sense, as I have written, constitutions are biographies of a country. It is a story that a country tells itself about itself. Just like any autobiography, the story might be true or false, but a constitution is both about a structure of government and a narrative about the identity of a nation. It is the mirror of what a country is or aspires to be. I'm quite happy to elaborate on that. Most constitutions are written. Of course, there are constitutions that are not written. The United Kingdom and New Zealand do not have written constitution, but their constitutional orders are as entrenched as the constitutional order of the United States, which has one of the oldest written constitutions in force. In whatever form constitution appear, and whatever system has adopted them, constitutions have several functions in common, or several features in common. First, a constitution sets up a system of government, a parliamentary system, a presidential republic, a monarchy, or a variation of those three. It then allocates power within that system, who legislates, who adjudicates, and who enforces. The fragmentation of power among this branch of government, separation of powers, as we call it in the United States, is not only for the purpose of delineating the function of the various parts of government, but also to ensure that power is not concentrated. Checks and balances, as we say in the United States. The assumption is, and it is a well-founded assumption, that highly concentrated power is a threat to liberty. Of course, many constitutions have another additional layer to protect the liberty of citizens. Federalism can be viewed as one such check. A federalist structure is meant to constrain power from another angle. But there is a third way of controlling power, and that is a system of human rights. And most countries have a system of human rights in their constitution. As you know, the Ethiopian Constitution in Chapter 3 has enshrined most of the rights in the International Bill of Rights as part of the Constitution. But as you also know, constitutionalization is no guarantee that those rights will be enforced unless you have the right structure and you have a constitutional culture. Second, whatever system of government constitution set up, and however differently they might distribute institutional power, whether vertically or horizontally, separation of power, all constitutions have one purpose, and this is very important. They are meant to bring people together. Constitutions are meant to constitute the demos, the people, a political community. Building a sustainable political community is the purpose of constitution. Constitutions are meant to forge and develop a political community that enables members to see each other as co-participants in a common project, rather than as strangers engaged in existential struggle against one another. In this regard, constitutions acknowledge, as an empirical matter sometimes, or constitute anew, as a normative matter, a people, singular, a people. That is, constitutions are meant to transform strangers into co-citizens with equal membership, to turn hard parameters into soft parameters over time. Otherwise, the long-term survival of a political community is in doubt. If citizens do not see each other as equal members and as participants in a common project, the durability of the political community is in serious doubt. I'll say more about this when I talk about the Ethiopian Constitution later. Third, constitution signal as to who the sovereign is, who has adopted and ordain the Constitution. That is, constitutions identify, often explicitly and sometimes implicitly, who the ultimate sovereign is. This is not merely symbolic, it has practical consequences. I'll say more about this. And fourth, constitutions are relatively entrenched, relatively difficult to change. In the United States, for example, the Constitution under Article 5 requires that 2/3 of each house of the Congress, the Senate and the House of Representatives, must vote affirmatively by 2/3 majority before an amendment could be submitted for ratification. And then that amendment has to be ratified by 3/4 of the states, minimum of 38, before it becomes part of the Constitution. I'll talk about the amendment process in the Ethiopian Constitution later. As I said, entrenchment is built on the proposition that you do not want to turn basic documents into glorified statutes. Amendments would be unsettling, not just to the document, often, frequent amendments would be unsettling, not just to the document, but to the community, which has structured itself around that document. In some constitutions are to be entrenched and to be relatively hard to change. But there is a condition. This, of course, assumes that the Constitution was adopted legitimately and it has the basic structure right. That is, the Constitution is legitimate both sociologically and normatively. By sociologically, I mean that relevant actors, and including the people, view it as being legitimate. Normatively legitimate, by that I mean that it settles justly and effectively the constitutional issues before the country. So let me now talk briefly about the Ethiopian Constitution, how well it measures up to these various features of Constitution that I mentioned. I'm not going to talk about an examination of the Ethiopian Constitution provision by provision. That's not what I intend to do here. I simply want to select a few provisions so as to see how the Constitution deals with the notion of building a political community. First, the source of sovereignty. Who is the sovereign? Because that too is important for building a political community. Constitutions announce in their preambles, usually in their preambles, who the sovereign is, who has adopted and ordained the document, or on behalf of which or what people the document is adopted. Of course, there are other functions for preambles, but here I just want to concentrate on the issue of who the ultimate sovereign is. Almost all national constitutions, which have preambles, and most of them do have preambles, begin "We the people of country X," or its variations such as "the people of country X" or "the citizens of country X" as the ultimate sovereign, which have ordained and adopted the Constitution. The people are both the originators and the addressees of the basic document. They are the originators because they gave the document to themselves. They are the addressees because the document is meant to organize and regulate their affairs, their relationship with their government and their relationship with fellow citizens. The reference is to one people, singular, either as a descriptive or as a normative matter. The Ethiopian Constitution is only one of two national constitutions in the world currently enforced, which refers to peoples or nations in the plural at the source of the constitutional power or as entities of sovereignty. The other is the Constitution of Bosnia-Herzegovina. As you know, this is a country that emerged out of the fracture of the former Yugoslavia. The preamble to the Constitution referred to the Bosniaks, Croats, and Serb people, the three people. But there is a crucial difference between the two preambles, which makes the Ethiopian Constitution to rather stand alone. Unlike the Ethiopian Constitution, the Constitution of Bosnia-Herzegovina includes in its preamble the undifferentiated citizens of Bosnia and Herzegovina as having had a part in adopting and ordaining the Constitution. The citizens of Bosnia-Herzegovina are sovereign, not just as Serbs and as Croats, but as citizens of Bosnia-Herzegovina. No such thing in the Constitution of Ethiopia, for there is no undifferentiated we the people or we the citizens of Ethiopia. As a matter of legal construction, Ethiopia is not a nation of citizens, but as one author declared, a nation of nations, somewhat closer to a confederation than a federation. Ethiopians are sovereign, as I said, not as Ethiopians, but as members of the various nations. Ethiopians are not linked to one another directly as citizens or as a people. The link is mediated through their membership to the various nations to which they belong. That identity, not Ethiopian citizenship, is a prism through which individuals see and evaluate one another and the issues before them. It's not quite clear what the term peoples in the Ethiopian Constitution actually means. To be sure, the Constitution attempts to define it elsewhere, Article 39(5). But that open-ended and somewhat unclear definition or description is said to apply to nations and nationalities as well. Why three different terms are used when they apparently mean the same thing is rather unclear. One cannot clarify the meaning of a term by adding other equally problematic terms to the list. Even though the Ethiopian Constitution is the only one, essentially the only one that has peoples as part of its preamble, there is another organic or basic document that uses the term "we the peoples," and that is the United Nations Charter. The United Nations Charter is the constitution of the international community. It starts "we the peoples." But of course, the United Nations was not established as a federation or even confederation, but as a forum for independent countries. The same thing with the European Union, another document that says "we the peoples." Sometimes one can say it is unsurprising that the various groups who have been designated as peoples and nations seem to view themselves as mini countries with their own security apparatuses. The level of force that some of the states have developed and at times display with great fanfare seem to indicate at least the states think of themselves as if they were many countries, and as if a country size security apparatus is the definition of a nation. So while almost all national constitutions are designed to transform strangers to co-participants in a common project, I'm afraid the Ethiopian Constitution seems to go in the opposite direction. Switzerland is at times cited as an example of a country whose federal arrangement resembles and inspires the federalism in Ethiopia. Although I have not made a thorough comparison between the Swiss Constitution and the Ethiopian Constitution, and I intend to do that, I see crucial differences between the two of which I shall mention here. First, unlike the Ethiopian Constitution, which chooses the sovereignty of we, the Ethiopian people, but instead says we, nations, nationalities, and peoples, the Swiss Constitution actually begins with we, the Swiss people. And the Swiss people are an important part of the sovereign entity that granted that document to themselves. Second, unlike the Ethiopian Constitution, I don't believe the Swiss cantons were drawn along ethnic lines. I think there are about 26 cantons, and obviously a lot less number of linguistic groups. So to think about sovereignty lodged in fragmented people has an impact on the scope and utility of national citizenship. Ethiopian citizenship doesn't tie people directly. Ethiopian citizenship becomes secondary and derivative. I'll say more about that. What is interesting also is, while there is diversity, fragmentation at the national level, there seems to be a unitary system at the regional level. So if one looks at some of the basic laws or constitutions of the regional state, there is an assumption of a unitary constitutional order. So for example, some constitutions begin, we the people, not peoples, we the people of such and such nation. And remember, nation is defined under Article 39 as being essentially ethnic group. So that notion of being a nation seems, at least symbolically, not to entertain the possibility that people that are not part of that nation and are part of that political community and have the same rights and obligations and other citizens that are part and parcel of that nation. And one could look at, if you want to talk about some of them, I'll be quite happy to talk about those as well. So if you want to build a people, fragmenting at the national level and having a unitary system at the general level might not be the way to go about it. A second difficulty that I see in the current constitution, and everyone has talked about it, is the cessation provision. Everyone knows about the cessation provision here, so here I'm not really going to go in some detail, but to give some comparative context. As you know, Article 39 recognizes the unconditional right of nations to complete the process of self-determination and to establish themselves as full-fledged countries if they so wished, if they demanded. And then that demand would be approved by a majority of the residents. I've written that the idea of constitutionalizing secession is a terrible idea. And it's no accident that there are many nations that have constitutionalized secession. There are only 5 nations. And that constitutionalized of secession is for quite often a one-off issue, but very different from the issue that Ethiopia faces and has faced for a very long time. There's very number of significant ways in which the constitutional right of secession might continue to undermine the possibility of building a sustainable and relatively peaceful national political community. The first is the likelihood that the right to exit will be deployed by politicians and activists to a never-ending strategic use of blackmail, extorting power or resources, even when that extraction might be unjust. Article 39 gives the language of law to those who want to use secession as a leverage. The fully ethnicized federal structure with the right of secession to the constituent parts of the federation at any time for any purpose will continue to be a disincentive to a collective life and to the integrity process. And even more, the process of open and sincere deliberation about fair terms of cooperation, essential for a democratic process, essential for a collective life, will be the casualty of continuing secession as a constitutional right. And a constantly destabilized national life will be far from conducive to accommodating diversity, as we have seen in many for the last few years. And the number of people or nations which have the right to demand the legal recognition sovereign entities seems to be, at least theoretically, to be endless to the extent that Article 47 allows nations and nationalities to establish their own states named after their own name or ethnic name. So the more states you have, the more strategic use of secession will have an enormous destabilizing impact on national life. And it's also possible that the constitutional right of secession will give another incentive to strident politicians and activists to engage in forcible displacement of residents from other ethnic or linguistic groups. Internal displacement is a pathogen that describes the politics of difference. Let me make it clear. I'm not arguing that secession is not legitimate anytime for any reason. No, there might be time where secession might be the only way for resolving the tension. As a matter of political morality, there might be certain circumstances that would justify exit from a union, even if it is not a constitutionalized right. That's a different issue altogether. There might be, for example, circumstances when a group has been and continues to be dominated in a morally arbitrary way that would rise to the right of political divorce. But as I said, that's a different story altogether. Let me talk about the amendment process for a moment. As I mentioned earlier, the amendment process is for constitution is as difficult as it should be. And I've mentioned what the United States Constitution provides. The Ethiopian Constitution provides for an amendment process as well. In fact, as I see it, if my reading is correct, there are two different procedures for amendment. For most of the provisions, the procedure is somewhat very similar to the procedure in the United States Constitution. However, the second amendment procedure meant to apply to Chapter 3 of the Constitution requires that not only there be 2/3 of each house of parliament, but a unanimous support of state council for there to be an amendment in Chapter 3. As you know, Article 39 is inserted in Chapter 3 as a fundamental political right or democratic right. And that makes it very difficult to amend. The odds of getting unanimity among states is long, and it will keep on going longer because as more entities establish themselves as states pursuant to Article 47, the odds get longer. Imagine that there are 15 states. One state has 400,000 people. That state could veto an amendment. I am big on minority veto. I've written a great deal about minority rights and ethnic rights. But minority veto ought not to be put entrenched in such a manner. It would totally frustrate democratic and majority rule in such a manner, because the consequence would be a frustrated majority. And a frustrated majority will not be a good thing for entrenching a democratic process. And I'll say a couple of things about citizenship, and I could talk about citizenship a great deal. I have written about Ethiopian citizenship. Ethiopian citizenship, in my view, there is no problem in having multiple dual citizenship or multiple citizenship. I think we should have dual citizenship, citizenship at the regional level, citizenship at the national level. And there are many countries that have dual citizenship. The United States is one of them. But the United States is not the only country that have a federal system. I think there are about 25 countries with a federal system. But there are other countries with dual citizenship. The United States, for example, under the 14th Amendment says that there is a US citizenship. Somebody born in the United States is a citizen of the United States and a citizen of the several states. In fact, Switzerland has 3 citizenship: citizenship, Swiss citizenship, citizenship of the cantons, and municipal citizenship. So it's not the fact that there are multiple citizenship that is important or that is a difficult part of Ethiopian citizenship under the Constitution, but rather the relationship between Ethiopian citizenship and the citizenship of the several states. In my view, Ethiopian citizenship under the Constitution seems to resemble a little bit to the European Community citizenship than to a US citizenship. That is, the primary bond is the citizenship to the various nations rather than to the country. Indeed, in my view, Ethiopian citizenship is derivative, secondary and derivative. And that, of course, has consequences for linking individual citizens as individuals, as citizens engaged in a common project. You see, citizenship is about two things. It is providing full membership, and it is providing equal membership. And it means across the line. If I have time, I'll say something about the value of language in building a political community. But if not, I'll stop in a minute and I'll look for questions. The minimum requirement for a diverse society to exist as a stable political community is that members of the various groups be willing and able to communicate with one another. Political communities can sustain themselves over a long period of time only if there is shared understanding among members. There cannot be shared understanding if people cannot communicate with one another and have access to the same forums or conversations. The federal constitution provides every nation, nationality, and people has the right to speak, to write, and to develop its own language. This is a sentiment I fully share. I've written about language rights. Language is not just a means of communication, but an important cultural resource. It is often the means by which members of the linguistic group attach meaning and give structure to their cultural activities and rituals. Language is an important cultural software. Retaining and cultivating that resource seems to me to be important, not just for the countries, for the groups that speak the language, but for all of us, because that language is part of the national cultural resource or heritage. The right of people to speak and write this language will ensure the survival and flourishing of the language. The Constitution assumes as such.
Prof,
yeah.
I want to make sure, if you need more time, just take your time. We've got another 5-10 minutes. Don't be stretching to finish like a marathon. Just take your time.
Thank you. I'm glad you did that. I'll be finished. The right of groups, as I said, to speak and write its language will ensure the survival and flourishing of the language. The Constitution gives such a right, which I think is proper, to write and speak the languages of the particular group and to adopt a working language, as it says in Article 5.3. Assume many of the states have chosen a working language. But it is important if we are going to have a sustainable national political community, we have to have a national language or national languages. We might want to have two national languages, perhaps true. Of course, that depends on the resources the country has. Nothing signals more and more strongly that people are strangers to one another than the inability to comprehend one another. If we don't have a national language that is required across the land, then it might be that linguistic groups increasingly become strangers to one another. So at a minimum, it appears to me that it might not be a bad idea to have a requirement that national languages be taught across the land. Let me just finish in a couple of minutes by saying this. In a divided and diverse country, and the estimate is 80 ethnic groups, such as ours, the task of the fundamental law is to soften over time markers of alienage or difference, not to freeze and even make them more salient. If we have to be honest with ourselves, the current constitution has made ethnic identity a central and an all-purpose organizing identity, not only in political life, but in all other aspects of life. I am a big believer and have written a great deal about a system that simultaneously accommodates diversity while building sustainable national political community. We have to do that, both at the basic structural level and by adopting appropriate electoral system. At the basic structural level, our country may find it difficult to survive, let alone flourish, if we don't have a federal system. But the question is, what is the federal system that strikes the appropriate balance between integrative association and accommodation? By my count, there are 25 countries with a federal system, from India to Nigeria, from Australia to the United States, from Canada to Switzerland. We ought not to think that our problem is unique and we can't learn from other countries. The problem with the current document is not that it is federalist. In my view, it is because it tends to solidify and freeze identities rather than make them softer. And I intend to write a number of essays, and I started to do that. What would be the appropriate constitutional structure that would balance the desire to accommodate diversity and the recognition that a strong national identity would have to be built if the country is to survive. My fear is this: even if the country survives under the current arrangement, my fear is that it would be very difficult to develop a democratic culture under the system, because issues have become defined around identities. There is instability, a great deal of instability. And that instability would not lead to adopt very important ingredients for the democratic process. That is accommodation, that is tolerance, and that is compromise. You see, if issues are defined as interests, compromise is possible. If issues are defined as identities, compromise is very difficult. Who wants to compromise over one's identity? I think we ought to get the balance together. There is another fear. The instability of this constitutional order would encourage centralization rather than decentralization. That would be the irony. The reason is national leaders would increasingly centralize power on the account that the country's integrity and the country's stability demands it. We don't want to do that. We have to have a structure, both that distributes power and that checks power at various levels of government, but that also leads us to a national community where citizens view one another as engaged in a common project. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof, for the very clear and sort of articulated perspective. I'm sure you can imagine that your presentation has generated interesting discussions and people coming in with different perspectives. And I will definitely try to moderate the discussion with that purpose in mind. The good thing is, just as we talked, as we discussed previously, as we prepped, I'm looking forward to this discussion because I would like to engage you in some of these items. And I think I would try to sort of, because as an organization, ELPANA is also non-partisan, but at the same time try to sort of accommodate all the various perspectives and interests. You will not be surprised that some of my questions would sort of, will take the position of trying to sort of look at the different perspectives and get your discussion and dialogue going on. Because at the end of the day, I think that's the most critical thing we need to do for Ethiopia, is the fact that people with different perspectives need to come together and discuss and try to sort through the various options. So the questions I got are sort of, could be classified into different buckets. I got some questions around the whole independent constitutional review, the House of Federation, the Council of Constitutional Inquiry, structural type questions. A lot of questions deal with what I consider to be the managing diversity. How do we sort of make the balancing act between ensuring that the multinational sort of federal structure is sort of considers some of the national purpose, as you consider it, the integrative association perspective of what the Constitution needs to be. And then there are some equal protection related questions. I'll also try to impose, interpose some of my questions. So let me start with the first set. And it doesn't have, and what I will do is I'll get started, and then you can, we'll make it free flow. And as folks come up with more questions, we will try to share it with you. So, starting with the diversity management challenges, of the Constitution, or even the future constitutional order, I sincerely believe, and this is something which I have expressed before, that addressing the historical imbalances in terms of where the country was formed, the state formation, historical underpinnings for Ethiopia, and the fact that we need to have a system that allows the articulation of some of those concerns in terms of both the ethno-linguistic cultural perspectives, as well as the sharing of resources and power at the federal government, is sort of one of the core things which the Constitution, whether its current form or future form, needs to address. So I've got a question from Israel Gobana, who's a great friend of mine, and he said, when we have strong disagreements around the historical past, how do we want the Constitution to balance and reflect the needs of this diversity and national purpose, and how do you get to that consensus? I mean, how do we, when we're actually having this strong disagreement about the history and the foundation of the state, how do we get to that consensus?
That clearly is what these conversations are meant to do. But conversations, and you can stay on.
I will.
So clearly there is general conversation, which obviously we're doing now. That's something we're engaged in. But that conversation ought to be concentrated and focused as well. That is, that it specifically is designed to have participants from various views. Now, there are a number of, my view is, and obviously I have written about how to accommodate in an article called Deliberative Democracy in Fractured Societies. But the idea is to have a conversation that is focused. This is general. This is obviously one-to-one or one-to-many.
Yeah.
Focus. Some people have suggested a constitutional convention. That might or may not work. Some people have suggested establishing an expert group, including historians, whatever it is, that might have some ground for people's subsequent conversation. That is, it has to be focused and it has to be organized. But it seems to me to be difficult to say we are divided about our past, so we're locked into going nowhere. And that seems to me to be not a good solution. We have a past. We have a past, and we learn from the past that we ought not to be prisoners of our past. That is, we ought not to say, this is how I understand our past, this is how you understand our past, and not engage in conversation. And there are times where the past might have to be past if we want to go forward. Now, which past ought to be past, which past ought to be part of the conversation is obviously part of that conversation. But there has to be a unorganized, focused conversation. And obviously, that's what was said to have happened a few years ago. But there is argument to be made that was done in a war, in a context of a conflict that has just ended. And when you have a document that comes out of that conflict in that short period of time, you're thinking about resolving the issue for that specific time. People together, the country is falling apart. Well, we have been given time to reflect now. And our conditions have given us time to see what works and what doesn't work. I've looked at various countries, Nigeria and various countries. So I agree, and I'm a big believer in diversity, and my work does in fact do that. But I think it would be the casualty of not having a sense of the political community would be accommodation as well.
Yeah.
And you see it in the current arrangement. That is, whether or not groups have been accommodated within the regional groups. The irony is the Constitution is meant to liberate nations, but it didn't say anything about minorities within those nations. When you create nations, there are nations within those nations, and the constitutional structure has to ensure that there is a mechanism.
Yep. That's very, very helpful. So this actually is a good segue to another question we have from Dunya Tagaing. And Dunya actually specifically called out the issue, the problems with some of the regional constitutions, where there has been some argument that they might actually be violative of the federal constitution in terms of equal protection or granting of citizenship, for folks who live in those regions. Maybe you can sort of provide some of your perspective around regional constitutions, the idea of even the constitutional equal protection provision in Article 25, and see how there could be an argument to be made that some of those regional things need to be tweaked. And in connection with that, because I'm trying to combine two or three things together, Ephraim Yaman Abraham had a very good question. This is sort of one of the most debated questions, and we talked about that in reference to the origins of the US Constitution. The issue of defective beginnings behind the Constitution, there's the fact that, I was sort of partly involved in some of the process, that a lot of people were excluded, or at least political leanings were excluded from the 1995 Constitution. Does that actually, mean that we need to start from zero? Is there any redemptive over process sort of way how we can work on an amendment the way the US Constitution had evolved? So Ephraim had a question around defective beginnings. So maybe you can tackle those two questions, and then we'll take more.
Well, in terms of the regional documents, I've actually completed document that is going to the publisher, Journal of Developing Societies. I looked at a number of the constitutions, and those constitutions actually have both a symbolic and substantive exclusion. Don't forget the symbolic exclusion. And it's very important because it has enormous impact. Some of the constitutions say the state of these people. For example, the state of the Harare people. Now, then we kind of think, well, what is the position of Ethiopians in that framework as being part of that state? What is their status? That's the symbolic part. In fact, and of course, you know, there are others that say the state of these people, or even the Oromia state. The name symbol is very important, and I'm not particularly, but when it says the state of these people, that is actually exclusionary. That is state of the Harare, symbolically. There was actually a big argument when Macedonia was set up, and it talked about the Macedonian people, although there are Turks and others, and people say Macedonia is for all of us. So don't say the Macedonian people, because Macedonia refers to a particular group. So that's the symbolic. But there is substantive part. For example, some constitutions begin, we the people of this nation. We the people of the Oromia nation. And nation, remember, has been defined under Article 39 to mean a particular ethnic group. So it doesn't say we the peoples, it says we the people of the Oromia nation. Now the question becomes, how does the notion of nation work here in terms of minorities, in terms of how minorities fit in the system? And some constitutions, the Benishangul Constitution is a good example, Article 2, if I remember. This Article 2 says this group are the sovereign group. It actually says it acknowledges there are other citizens, but it says that for purposes of ownership, as it says, and sovereignty, these 5 groups, as I remember it, are a group. That too has an important impact on what it means to be an Ethiopian citizen and what an Ethiopian citizen gets you when you travel. And obviously, you know, the Harare Constitution provides also that the upper house is constituted by ethnic Hararis. Now, it might be defended, but I'm just saying that there are, to the extent that the Constitution honors and tries to protect Ethiopian citizenship, it is undermined
by the regional constitutions. Yeah.
And Ephraim's question, let me just briefly go to that. Yeah, defective beginning. What makes defective beginning a very important aspect of the Ethiopian Constitution rather than the American Constitution is because of time. And the issue is clearly now, and we're still debating it, fighting it. And clearly the American Constitution was defective from the beginning, but it took a war, a civil war where many people died. And we clearly don't want to engage in a destructive war. We don't want to engage in such a war. But there is something to be said about defective beginning, but not because defective beginning on its own should disqualify a document. It might have come to its own that defective document, but because it is still viewed as defective. That's the difference. And it is viewed as defective, if it is, as defective in two senses. That is, it lacks sociological legitimacy and it lacks normative legitimacy. By sociological legitimacy, I mean legitimacy that says, does it have the legitimacy among the relevant actors, the people? Do they view it as legitimate? That's sociological legitimacy, empirical. The other is what can be referred to as normative legitimacy. By normative legitimacy is, has it resolved the important issue fairly and justly? There too, there is question. That's why it makes it very difficult as it is now. And obviously, the short time period isn't, we're talking about it.
Okay, helpful, very, very helpful perspective. Let me interpose a very quick question just to sort of, wrap up the issue about the regional constitutions, and then we'll talk about structural issues. We have a couple of questions from there as well. So I think the way I heard you describe it, I mean, you can clearly see a distinction between Oromia as a constitutive region and people who live in Oromia. So I mean, it's not like we're trying to get rid of Oromia, or because there are settled expectations of the last 30 years in terms of how regions and structures have been built up. So
interestingly, let me add there, and I didn't, and this might be controversial, but this is the truth. I looked at all of the constitution. The Amhara constitution actually says the people living in the Amhara region. That's what it says. The people living in the Amhara region, rather than the Amhara nation.
Okay.
It doesn't. So it's not. My idea is, because nation is such a difficult word, such an ambiguous term. If a constitution says this nation is the sovereign, or we, the people of this nation, then you have to think, well, what does nation mean? Does it have the same definition, as I assume it does, that Article 39.5 does? Although Article 39.5, this definition of people, nations, national.
Requires more clarification, most probably.
No idea why there are three terms if they define them as one, but.
No, I agree with the point. I think that might be one of the compromise discussions, is like, we keep the regions, but that, the concept of equal protection, the concept of common citizenship and protection of minorities, which is actually becoming quite an issue, today, it's, could sort of be addressed in that framework.
Could be inclusive, symbolic.
Inclusive.
Okay. That is, we might say we are,
Okay. Structure. I never thought that in a discussion on lawyers that there would be anybody who would be trying to see how the House of Federation structure might be defensible. But Ala Ahmed has a good question. So he said, is it possible under the current situation when we have two divergent perspectives around the country and its history, is it, because there was this concern, and I remember that because I was one of the people who tried to sort of argue for judicial review in 1994, and we were definitely shut down gloriously. It was interesting that the concept of fear of leaving it to the lawyers and to the judges was the militant factor behind that setup. But is there any? Are there any adjustments? And Kalab clearly said that this is not his opinion. He's just sort of postulating a position. And is there anything that can be done to adjust it and empower the Council of Constitutional Inquiry with more sort of affirmative power? Is there some way you can fix it, or do we just scrap that and go the full either constitutional court judicial review process? He just wanted to get your perspective.
So in terms of playing a role
in the Constitution drafting and settling disputes and things of that sort?
I'm down.
Okay, good.
Down on that. Because remember what I said, that if you want to build a constitutional culture, like any other culture, it has to be systematic, coherent. And politicians are nothing but coherent.
Yeah.
And it would be resolving the particular dispute in the realm of that particular period with the short-term interest. So I'm a big believer. Perhaps this is the lawyer in me, as you said earlier, the lawyer in us.
Yeah.
But I think we ought to have independent judicial interpretation. Let me add here, Bosnia as a governor, even with all of the problem it has had, the instability, the best part has been the Constitutional Court of Bosnia. That has actually moved that country forward.
Yeah, I think, if I have to editorialize my own opinion, I agree with you. I think, some sort of a separate independent structure, whether it's a constitutional court system or the judicial review would be the best thing. I mean, I would say as a perfect example of why the current system didn't work. I mean, the fact that the conflict between the federal government and the Tigray regional force couldn't be resolved by the House of Federation, or the Abiy administration basically took the case to the various, to some extent self-conflicted House of Federation to sort the election issue. I think it's a case in point. I mean, I'm not sure whether or not taking it to a constitutional court or to a separate court might have yielded a different result, but at least there would have been a little bit of a different third-party neutral arbitration in that. Yeah. Anyway, all right. So let me go to Mizan. Mizan had this question previously shared, and this also deals with the structure, and I think it fits in with the House of the Federation. If the House of the Federation at some point, is being revised and might have a little bit of a structural change, what's your perspective about, having a direct election of the House of Federation, rather than sort of things getting the members being designated by the regions, as it's currently the case?
And I'm just looking at the particular article. I thought the article, just here. I thought the article actually gives the alternative to states, huh?
Yes. Yeah, you're right. Yeah, the article actually provides the states can actually do direct election, or they could do the designation.
Yeah. So there is that option now, and so yes. I assume the question is, let's just make one option. No option, but I am a big believer in people having a say. I'm actually, and I'm also, this might be counterintuitive, but I'm also a believer that people would actually be a bit more stable than politicians in terms of how they deal with issues. So electing it, I think, would be a good thing. But for me, what is crucial is it ought not to play a judicial role. But electing it as a democratic entity is a good thing. I'm a big believer in the people having a say.
Direct say in that one.
And as you know, and of course, that was the case in the United States until the 17th Amendment, that senators were elected by the state legislators rather than elected by the people. But I don't think it has made much difference, but I prefer that they be elected by the people.
Perfect. All right. So I've got a great question from Dean Solomon Neguse, and we've been working with him on a number of things with ELPANA, so we really appreciate that he's joined us. on a Saturday afternoon in Addis. Din, thank you for joining us. He has a very good question. He says, in Ethiopia currently, there are different views about the Constitution. The first one favors scrapping the Constitution and starting from zero. The other one says it's the perfect document on earth. Nothing needs to be touched. We should keep it as is. And then there is the third option that says, we need to sort of start to have some discussion around amending the Constitution, having a national dialogue process. Which option do you think is viable and a possible one? What do you suggest should be the approach?
Well, that's a difficult question because I think that should be part of the conversation. Because I think one of the problems is we are locked into a particular strategy without hearing as to what the concerns of each group is, as to whether or not we should scrap it. I don't believe, that much I know, I don't believe that any document is a perfect document. I don't believe any document, especially this document, can be left as is. Because there are still problems we see. Now, whether or not we should start anew, or whether or not we ought to be selective in how we amend this Constitution. And you have to be strategic if you amend so that things cohere. Is a difficult question. And I think what we ought to do is have that conversation in a more focused way, rather than, and I'm thinking through this, I'm writing about this, but we ought to leave the options open, it seems to me, as to what people might want to do. But it's a very good question. Those are the options.
Yep.
Those are the options.
Okay. Next question is from another of my old professors, who is another good friend, Zacharias Hailu, who is in Minnesota. Zacharias has this question. Ethiopia is obviously a deeply divided country. I don't know if I can pronounce this, Zacharias. Constitutionalism as a concept. All right, concessionalism. Okay, concessionalism as a concept for peaceful conflict resolution is sometimes suggested by scholars for such situations like Ethiopia. What do you think about that, and as a method for conflict resolution?
Yes. In fact, I have written about consociation in that document that I refer to, Deliberation in Divided Societies. For those that that probably don't know what consociation is, it is a method that has been suggested. In fact, to some extent, Bosnia-Herzegovina is closer to a consociation method. What it has is, the executive has 3 people coming from the 3 groups. So it is, and I'm not quite sure without the Constitution that would have worked. Consociation advocates for a mechanism that would allow political elites within the various ethnic groups to share power. That's what it does. It's called Grand Coalition. Grand Coalition. Power sharing is what it is, and it's among elite groups. An important ingredient of consociation is proportional representation. Significant groups, and that, in the Ethiopian sense, who is represented, who is significant, is a serious problem, given the number of groups. Consociation is used in Lebanon, and Lebanon hasn't functioned well. So clearly, as I said, an important ingredient is proportional representation, and the other is minority veto, that a minority can veto. My problem with consociation is it encourages rather than discourages strident ethnic politics. That's what it does. That is, power revolves, so it becomes a fight. among various ethnic groups and elites. It endorses and reinforces the combination of ethnic-based parties and proportional representation. That, it seems to me, doesn't provide incentive, in my view, to ethnic parties to make appeal across ethnic lines. Politics becomes a zero-sum game.
Mhm.
And it doesn't encourage long-term stability. I've argued to that effect in my work.
Okay.
I don't know whether that answers your question, but here it is.
We'll engage him. We'll engage him at some point. By the way, hopefully, sorry, go ahead. I think you're on mute, Prof.
Oh, am I?
No, I heard you, but you said I thought you were saying something at the end.
No, I just say good to hear from Zacharias.
Okay, perfect. And again, I mean, one of the hopeful things we will do, with ELPANA and with this type of discussions is to have this type of civil sort of debates and discussions so that we can sort of contribute to the process, and hopefully we'll try to play a role in that one. Next question is from a fellow board member, Freo Samuel, who is asking a question about your perspective on land ownership, its relation to citizenship, in terms of where things are in the Constitution. Your take on it.
Let me beg to defer that, because I haven't looked at the land ownership issue very closely in the Constitution. So I might not be able to shed light on that specific issue. But to the extent that that other Ethiopians are excluded, that is, Ethiopians who are not member of that nation excluded from land ownership, that raises the problem of citizenship, obviously. But I'm afraid I'll have to look at land ownership.
Okay. I would say, in 94, 95, beyond the diversity management issues around Article 39 and in some of the other things, the land ownership issue was one of the heavily contested, or at least debated points back there, because it sort of relates to property and ownership and things of that sort. Appreciate that. So let me take one more questions. I'm trying to sort of figure out if folks still have questions. Please go ahead and send them. I think I may have reviewed all the questions, but I will wait for to see if I see anything. If folks want to ask either in the Q&A or they can do that in the chat. Mizan has a follow-up question, I think. Mizan said the House of Federation is vested with an distinct power of both the judiciary and the legislature, which calls into question the constitutional structure, or rather lack thereof, of checks and balances and separation of powers designed to prevent centralization of power. What's your take on that sort of dynamic?
That's a good point.
Yep.
That's a good point. Of course, one of the reasons why we want to have an independent judiciary is a check on the legislative process, on the legislative body. So to the extent that a particular body has both a judicial function and a legislative function, it is a concentration of power of sort, and it undermines the notion of checks and balances. But even on the merits, I think, as I said, a political body is not a good institution engaged in judicial review. If we want to have the appropriate political constitutional flesh on that document, as I call it, then it has to be a body that can have sustained and coherent practice.
Okay. So I have I use my privilege to ask you a question, because part of what we do as lawyers and as people engage in constitutional discussion is to push the envelope, to go to where taboos are raised, and try to sort of get the discussion going on. You've made references to the South African Constitution, one of the most progressive constitutions in the continent. And in their equal protection clause, they have actually specifically provided protection for sexual orientation and for LGBTQ rights.
Well, that's what the court said.
Sorry?
That is what the court said in its decision, is it not?
No, there's actually specific provision in Article 9.3. Maybe they amended the Constitution after the court interpreted it, similar to what happened in the US Supreme Court.
Yeah, yeah.
Now, people would say that's not a priority, that's not an issue in Ethiopia, and all types of things are raised. But what's your take? Where is the scope, and what do we think about the outer limits of the equal protection clause?
Oh, that's a big and difficult question.
I told you it's going to be interesting, Prof.
In the larger universe, what is the limit of the protection clause? Well, here is what I know about the American Constitution, which I know and I teach. The Equal Protection Clause has been read more and more widely, and it is based, and obviously the gay right wasn't an equal protection issue, it was a liberty issue.
Due process issues, right?
Yeah. Includes one's right to form a relationship outside the traditional relationship and the court. But let's take equal protection. And now, the 14th Amendment simply says states shall not deny the equal protection of the law. But it doesn't tell you under what specific circumstance is equal and equal, or what circumstances have to exist for us to say that is inconsistent because it is an unequal treatment. It is clear that at the time that the 14th Amendment was adopted, that is the provision that has equal protection. Remember, after the war, the 14th Amendment is the War Amendment after the, and it says there shall be equal protection because there were people that didn't have equal protection, like African American. At that time, the intent of the framers clearly was that segregation was not unequal treatment. Segregation was consistent with equal treatment, because there were segregations when that amendment was adopted. But as you know, in the 1950s, the Supreme Court in Brown versus Board of Education said segregation is unconstitutional, at least in education, under the Constitution. Now, and this brings me to processes of constitutional interpretation. Processes of constitutional interpretation. If you were to go to original intent as a source of interpretation, this clearly, the result would be very different, because that wasn't the original intent of the framer. That's why I am down. I'm not a big fan of original intent as a source of constitutional interpretation. The idea here is, and I can talk about other sources of structural interpretation and other forms of interpretation. But what is relevant for us is this. The reason why the court could say that this is unconstitutional now, although it might have been viewed as consistent with Constitution, is this. The framers give us a general concept, the concept of equality. They didn't give us a specific conception of that concept. They gave us a general concept, equality, to last. And as we go on, as people, we figure out that what we have never seen as an equal treatment as a sociological matter appears to be an equal treatment. So our specific view of equal protection is clearly very different from their specific view of equality was based on some empirical facts that we have, they didn't have. Psychological inquiry, what segregation does to people, how it shapes them. They didn't have perhaps that. So the idea is when the framers give us general concepts, they're meant to last.
Mhm.
We በአማርኛ ልናገር ነበር።
Go ahead.
You know, equal protection is cashed out by generation as to what it means. Because every generation knows more about social relationship and the earlier relationship.
No, I think that's a very helpful, paradigm to think about it. I think the equal protection clause, at least, based on the 14th Amendment and its sort of jurisprudence, it sort of ties into what you discussed initially when you started with your presentation about the virtue of incompletion. I mean, it really is about how, the Constitution or the concept of equal protection is there to accommodate and add more people into the realm of protection of the Constitution. So, whether we're ready for that in Ethiopia, I think it's just an honest discussion we need to have about that.
And as I talk in various my work, sometimes incompletion is a virtue.
Yep.
You don't have to answer every question in a constitutional document because we get to know more about who we are. And that's why an independent court becomes very important that can adjust it. I know I look at constitutions. I tried to print the Nigerian Constitution yesterday. It clogged the printer. It was so long. Sometimes people want to have a glorified statute, and as they do more issues arise, and they go back and back.
Okay. And I think we've got most of the questions answered. We have a few more minutes remaining. Prof, let me give you the chance to see if you have any concluding remarks, any thoughts you want to sort of wrap up the discussion, and then I will pass it on to Sarah.
Well, I really don't, but I think the way to look at our Constitution, or any Constitution, is that it is an expression of a political community's desire to establish a mode of politics for collective life. A mode of politics for collective life. That is, we have to think as to how we act as a collective. But of course, that doesn't exclude the possibility of what I call in my work another layer of deliberation at the subnational level as well. That's what federalism does. And thank you for allowing me to appear.
One more before you say bye, Professor. I got the last question. I promised Dean Solomon because he came up with one last question. He wanted to get your perspective about whether it makes sense for us to change to a presidential system from a parliamentary system, because that might require, whether we like it, some sort of a consensus to pick one person. Thoughts on that one, and hopefully I have answered the Dean's.
That's a very good question, and that takes me to the Nigeria Constitution. I thought I had it.
Yeah, I think he actually mentioned it in his question. I dropped that issue from when I paraphrased.
So here is, I can't find it, but here is my general view. A presidential system is useful in one sense, at least in the Nigeria sense. Nigeria Constitution, I think it said you have to get 25% of the population in 2/3. I think it says 2/3 of the various states. I think there are over 30. That is, you have to appeal.
Yes.
The president is elected as an entity, and that president has to appeal to various groups. There is a threshold. You have, so that might moderate president actors. That is, that they will actually listen to the various groups. And that's the very true of a presidential system. That is, the president is elected outside the legislative process. But of course, what we have is a parliamentary republic, what Ethiopia is a republic. So I think that is one thing we might want to think about to the extent. But what matters is not just the name of the system, but whether or not there are links nationally that require groups to listen to others.
Yeah. Yeah.
And presidential system, at least in the Nigeria case, was meant to say, well, you want to be elected, you have to get this percentage of the electorate in this many states. But it is also the electoral law. I think we might have an electoral law that might moderate people. That is, that might make them talk to one another a bit more than they do now. What I don't think would be permissible, because the country will not survive, is if groups see one another as strangers, as threats, as rivals, and only appealing to a particular group with that power. And what happens is then more and more militant groups arise, because to be elected, you have to kind of protect your flank on the other side to ensure that you are elected by appealing to the group in a more militant way. So that is, and many countries have adopted presidential. Many more countries have adopted the presidential system than have parliamentary democracy. That's a good point.
Another interesting discussion to have.
I could talk another time about the presidential system as an alternative.
Thank you very much for your time, and I really appreciate the discussion. And thanks for all the questions. There might have been a couple I may have missed because my eyes and the chat thing is not working. But we'll try to get to you. And if there are specific questions, we will make sure that Professor Adeno gets back to answer those questions. So Sarah, I yield back the floor to you.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Professor Adeno. It's your depth of understanding on the subject matter and your vast experience in the area has definitely made today's webinar very instructive. We're already getting very good feedbacks on the chat option. So thank you very much.